Hello, welcome to the Likeville podcast. This is John Faithful Hamer. Today, we're going to be talking with historian Fred Bode about, well, everything. But Fred Bode is a historian that specializes in the United States. He's done a lot of work on the antebellum South, on census data, on movies, American culture, and he just is an all-around guy who knows about everything. It's really annoying and wonderful. But anyway, welcome, Fred. It's wonderful to finally have you on the podcast.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here. There was a famous cartoonist, many, many years ago, by the name of Al Capp. And Al Capp had this radio spot that he did every week. And he was always introduced as the man with an opinion on everything and an expert on nothing. So I kind of feel like Al Capp.
No. You're an expert on a lot of things. So I have so many questions I want to ask you, but the first one that just is uppermost in my mind, because you are sort of expert on American religion and evangelicalism. What is going on with American evangelicals and Trump? They are standing beside him. I mean, what was it? Karl Rove estimated that a couple million evangelicals didn't show up to vote for George W. Bush because that driving while intoxicated report came out, and they were really judgy about that. And so a lot of people, I mean, they didn't go and vote Democrat, but they sat on their hands and stayed home. So again and again, evangelicals, it seems, actually seem to care about moral issues and personal morality and piety, and yet all of that is just right out the window with Trump, and they're his most solid block, despite all of these, porn stars and everything. What's going on?
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. And the polls show that the great majority of evangelicals stick with Trump. They support Trump. They may be a bit dubious about his personal behavior, but they support him because, of course, they believe that he can finally fulfill or largely fulfill their agenda. And he's already showing he can do that. He chose Pence as his vice presidential running mate, who's now vice president, of course, who could be a possible successor to Trump, whether on his own
God
or
forbid.
whether through impeachment. He is their man. He is the guy who personifies the evangelical agenda regarding sexuality, regarding abortion, regarding marriage, regarding Israel. And look, I mean, Trump is delivering. He not only appointed Gorsuch to the Supreme Court, who shares that agenda, but he is now appointing judges to the district courts and, most importantly, to the appellate courts. And, that's going to be something that will take a long time to undo, actually. And look, he moved the American embassy to Jerusalem, which is this kind of weird thing
with American evangelicals.
American evangelicals. I mean, it's not weird given their view that Jews have to return to Israel in order for the apocalypse and the
end times
to
unravel,
to take place. It shouldn't be necessarily confused with any notion that American evangelicals suddenly think all Jews are wonderful people and they're all going to go to heaven anyway. Though I did talk to one who said, well, he thought God had a special place for Jews. Maybe not right, up front,
not
heaven,
front row seats to heaven,
up in the
the bleachers, the cheap seats,
right.
So they basically are not looking at him as a model of pious behavior, but they're looking at him as a somebody that's being used by God to get certain things.
And of
passed.
course, what has happened with American evangelicals, I think, over the years, is that an emphasis on righteous behavior and the centrality of righteous behavior has kind of fallen by the wayside. And it's become more a question of absolute moral stands on particular issues that is driving them, which is too bad. And it's too bad, of course, too, because they represent, maybe 25% of the American population, or even less. It may even be declining.
Yeah.
But through their power within the Republican Party, they can write these agendas.
Yeah, it's interesting. I saw I think it was Rick Santorum, who was on Meet the Press last week, and somebody asked him a similar question to what I just asked you. Said, what is it? How are evangelicals able to stomach all these scandals, these Trump scandals? And his response I thought was very interesting. And he said, well, I think it's very analogous to what a lot of progressives and liberals and feminists did when Bill Clinton was president. They didn't like the scandals. They were embarrassed by them, but they compartmentalized. They figured, hey, he's like pushing forward our agenda. He's doing the right things. And so we're just going to hold our nose and, look the other way and try not to pay too much attention to this. But he said it's a mistake. It's a mistake if you think that they approve of this behavior or that they disbelieve the accounts. He said, my impression is that they totally believe that he's guilty for these things. Most people believe it. They just, they're able to compartmentalize, the way that you just said.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, certainly that's part of it. I mean, the difference with liberals and Clinton is that liberals were not coming from a position of piety, of personal piety and morality. They were thinking simply primarily in political terms. Yeah, Clinton does these things, but it's really important to get these things passed. Besides, we really don't care all that much, about his sex life. But it's different with the evangelicals. They're doing more than just compartmentalizing the two. I think they're and I think maybe they've crossed a line.
It seems like that to me
I think they've crossed a line. Because you mentioned George Bush earlier and evangelicals who wouldn't vote for Bush and so on. But most evangelicals forgave George Bush, and they forgave him for good Christian reasons. George Bush really did find Jesus.
Yeah.
He really did.
And he actually did change his life.
And he changed his life.
He turned around.
You know? So that's an entirely different situation. Trump has not done that. Yeah, he says, oh, yeah, I'm a God-fearing Christian and stuff like that. But that's, no one believes that.
I'm just going to throw this out there. Like, do you think there's anything to be said, any connection in the fact that Trump grew up going to the church in New York with his father every single day, every single Sunday, and listening to, what is it, the guy who wrote How to Win Friends and Influence People? The Power of Positive Thinking. Is it Pierce or Pierce?
Peale. Vincent Peale.
Norman Vincent Peale.
And
Peale. That's who he went and heard. That was the sermons he heard every Sunday.
Well, that's very interesting. I know that, but it's very interesting because when Nixon moved to New York, Nixon, of course, was raised a Quaker. When Nixon moved to New York, he started going, or whenever he was in New York, would always go to Norman Vincent Peale's church. So here we have the two guys, whose commitment to piety may be called into question, both attending the same church.
No, it seems it's almost irresistible for me not to make a connection to his boosterism, to constant exaggeration as the sales real estate technique as a brand of Christianity. And it's a very different kind of Christianity than what you see in George W. Bush, for instance.
Oh, absolutely.
Like his is a much more standard issue American evangelicalism, right, where you're trying to amazing grace and change your life around and all that stuff, right? Yeah, I don't. It's very odd to me the attraction they have to him. Another thing that's funny, you're talking about crossing a line, is that it seems to me that, and this happens very often in American politics, the people sort of change hats and they're doing what now it seems like progressives are the ones that are on the political spectrum the ones that are most obsessed with personal piety. Right. So it's if you are if you have all the right politics like an Al Franken, but you have a blemish on in terms of your personal piety, some you've done something in the same way that not very recently George W. Bush, just it coming out that he was caught for drinking while intoxicated, driving while intoxicated, that was enough to have a lot of evangelicals turn on him, even though he had all the right political positions. Now, as we were just saying, the evangelicals seem to be able to look the other way on the personal piety as long as the person has the right policy and politics. Well, now it's progressives that seem to be the ones that are obsessed with personal piety as opposed to. I mean, what do you think's going on with that?
You're absolutely right, and I think there's no little bit of hypocrisy actually going on because, well, I guess you could trace it, I suppose, from the Harvey Weinstein revelations.
Yeah.
And, then with the rise of the Me Too movement and so on, this became it became for the Democratic Party and for political progressives almost a entry requirement to be considered a progressive or a Democrat to take a stand on these issues, in the same way that it has become an entry requirement to be a Republican, or to be a conservative in America. Though there may be more hypocrisy going on in the case of the Democrats and progressives.
So, how do you think that evolves? Because I mean, you've studied American politics over numerous centuries and American kind of political movements and the way they interact with each other. So what goes into a movement or a political party being more obsessed with policy and kind of power and getting things done versus personal piety? Like, what decides the mix? Do you have any idea like what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it absolutely has a history. I mean, you can trace the history in some ways back to the 19th century, but the modern history, I think, really begins during as a consequence of the Civil Rights Movement, when the Republican Party, people like Kevin Phillips, Vickery, and so on, got the notion, quite correctly, that there was a huge constituency out there that was now up for grabs for the Republicans. And if this happens during the period when Goldwater was emerging as the sort of dominant
conscience of a conservative
right-wing figure within the Republican Party. And this whole constituency is up for grabs. Disaffected white Democrats in the South, who were voting for Wallace, or they may have voted for Goldwater. They weren't too sure about Nixon. A lot of them voted for Wallace. But, that is the beginning of the era of the dog whistles that we're now familiar with. And the Republican Party capitalized on that very, very, very effectively. So I think it does have a very specific history. And it has not only to do, of course, with religious piety, and I don't want to call all these white Southern voters hypocrites necessarily, but you can mask a lot of things with piety, even though you believe it. And there is the racism, the feeling that their values have been overturned or risk being overturned by elites, as they see it, on the coasts, that America is no longer the place they believed in and grew up in. It's not the same. I mean, part of it is a result of larger forces that we're all victim to, right? But they were able to put somehow put causes onto this. So the Republican Party was able to do that, and it was successful. And now we have Trump. So, you had a kind of unholy alliance in the Democratic Party between progressives and Southern segregationists, right? That went back to the New Deal. And now you have, an unholy alliance in the Republican Party between, the Wall Street financiers and, people like the corporate America, who wants their tax cuts and this sort of thing, and this political base that is responsive to the Trumpian message.
The populism, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, another layer of this, I remember when I was in your class, I don't know, 22 years ago, something like that. I remember you had us read this one book, Stanley Elkin's, The Problem of Slavery
in Western Culture.
In Western culture. And it was as a
that's Davis.
Elkins,
Elkins is American slave, whatever
institutional life, or something like that.
Yeah.
But he has this theory which just sits with me, and I've been thinking about it a lot lately, where he talks about the men without connections, and he says that the abolitionists were really, really radical and uncompromising because they were not members of institutions, and institutions have a moderating effect on people, and they sort of let you know that you have to compromise to get things done, and you have to realize we live in a fallen world. You can't get everything you want. And he said whenever you have people that are shut out of major institutions, that has a tendency to make those people radicalize more and more, like the William Lloyd Garrison types, right? So I'm wondering if maybe something similar has been happening in the last 50, 60 years in American politics, where when evangelicals were largely locked out of, to some extent, they had done it by their decision, but also when they were sort of locked out of the main kind of national institutions and didn't have much say in the Republican Party or any party, they tended to be much more radical and much more uncompromising. But now that they've had quite a bit of power for a while, they're willing to compromise, and they're willing to sort of sit down with Wall Street people and, well, we can get on the same page on this. Whereas it seems as if progressives have felt totally alienated by the centrist politics of Bill Clinton for 2000, and then felt betrayed by Obama. And so progressives have felt increasingly kind of alienated from these major institutions. And so they are now the ones that are most uncompromising and sort of unwilling to work with political parties. It's just this strange
there's definitely an element of truth in that, because there's a big debate going on within the Democratic Party, particularly during this pre-election period when there are lots of state primaries. And who does the machinery of the Democratic Party support? Do you support, the guy coming up from the left, the Bernie Sanders guy, who, talks the progressive line in the Democratic Party, but, probably in a red district is not going to get elected? Or do you support this moderate Democrat, the guy who's soft on gun control, the guy, who doesn't like says he won't support Nancy Pelosi? What do you do within the Democratic Party in those situations? And it's a tough choice.
Oh yeah,
a really tough choice. And what I fear is, my own view is that getting rid of a Republican majority is right in Congress right now is the major thing that Americans, Democrats, progressives, liberals should be focusing on. And that means that progressives are going to have to compromise. They're not going to get all they want if they want a congressional majority. That's clear. But having an ability to prevent the passage of damaging legislation, having the ability to turn down disastrous nominees for regulatory agencies. All these things are pretty important, and I don't think that should be overlooked. I mean, my own sympathies lie with the progressive side, but in a two-party system where it's either going to be one party or the other, and if you don't vote and you sit the election out or vote for a third-party candidate, the party that you really, really, really don't like is going to win.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, I don't know. I've heard sort of strident arguments of on both sides, and I find both of them sort of unconvincing, because I can imagine scenarios wherein the people who say you want to be kind of safe and moderate, right? The problem with that is that usually when they say you should go for a kind of a more centrist, kind of moderate position, they base it on opinion polls of the voters in that particular area. But what they don't factor in, or at least I've never heard any of the pundits factor this in when they're talking about it, is voter turnout. Voter turnout is pretty low, all right, especially for these kinds of races. So does it make sense to do an opinion poll of a particular area and say, well, 70% of people in this area believe X? Well, how many of them are actually going to show up to vote, right? So, and that's why I think the sort of the Trump strategy was it's better to be loved by a very, very vocal and motivated minority than to be sort of liked by 50 plus one, and then they don't even end up showing up to vote, a lot of them, right? So it's, in some districts, it probably makes sense to go with a really strong progressive message, because that'll actually get people out to vote. Absolutely. Right? They'll be highly motivated.
Absolutely.
Right? But in other areas, it won't. And that would be very hard if I had the job of having to figure out who's supposed to do what, right?
Yeah, of course, the opinion polls now attempt to take into account likely voters as well, so it's not, I don't know the technicalities of it or how reliable it is, but they certainly try to do that to get the opinion. Particularly party polling looks at people who are likely to vote. And, there are demographics of people who are likely to vote too, so you can to some extent control for that. But I think that in places where progressives have a good chance, absolutely, those are the people the party should support. But take this guy Lamb in Pennsylvania who won. Could a real progressive have won in that Pennsylvania off-year election? Probably not. Maybe I'm wrong, but probably not.
There's just not the support. They don't have the. It's not going to happen.
Yeah. On the other hand, the Democrats have to get their act together on issues that people who are genuinely alienated from the political system that will appeal to them, and issues that really speak to their needs and their interests. And that doesn't just mean being whooshy on gun control or on abortion or Nancy Pelosi or things like that, but it means speaking, of course, more positively about things in their towns that are wrong, that need to be righted. I mean, you got, a state like West Virginia that, is a solid Democratic state. And, why has it suddenly become overwhelmingly Republican? And, why is their Democratic senator probably the most conservative Democrat now in the Senate?
Yeah.
Manchin's the Secretary of Treasury. Manchin. Why was there that big change? I don't think it was because of racism. It's partly because of the coal industry. But, what answers do the Democrats have to the decline of the coal industry, to the ravaging of these communities with drugs, the opioid crisis. I'm not sure they've come up with very viable answers.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're very much.
And don't ask me what they should be. I'm not.
Yeah. Well, I think they, in the same way that the Republican Party is a coalition of some interests which don't necessarily play well together, the Democratic Party is also kind of a mix of interests and it's kind of into the structure of the Democratic Party that they can't offer the kind of solutions that would be really helpful to West Virginia.
But every political party in the United States is going to be a coalition.
Yeah.
In a two-party system. The third parties come again, now and then. But every major party is going to be a coalition. At sometimes, elements in the coalition are more dominant. At other times, it's something else. But they're all coalitions.
Do you think we could see something like what you saw in the 1850s with the dissolution of the Whig Party? Like, do you think we could see sometime in the near future the dissolution of the Republican Party?
I think we could. Yeah, I think absolutely we could.
Because there's a lot of very, very smart, powerful, influential Republicans who just the never Trumpers who just feel like the party has
abandoned them.
And has abandoned itself. Has abandoned. Like, I just watched a YouTube video from David Frum, Canadian guy, Canadian American, and he wrote Trumpocracy, which is in this emerging literature, which I call anti-Trump lit. His book is by far the best edition so far that I've read a lot of them. It's fantastic. But he had a YouTube video just the other day and where he talked about everything that was happening. And you can just, like, on his face and everything he's talking, he's like, I don't even know what this party stands for anymore. Like, what are we? And like, if enough people feel that way, and if Trump doesn't, get impeached or get out, then I don't know. Do they go and form some other kind of party, like a libertarian party, or I don't know. I mean, what can you imagine as a sort of what if scenario?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine what could happen, but I mean, you talk about the 1850s, and I think it's appropriate to talk about the 1850s. As people always paid a lot of attention to the split of the Whig Party and the emergence of the Republicans. But really the big story in the 1850s was the split and disintegration of the Democratic Party, actually, as Southern Democrats, pro-slavery Southern Democrats, came to dominate the party more and more. And every candidate, whether they liked it or not, for national office, think Stephen Douglas, had to accede to the positions of the most extreme pro-slavery Democrats. And just like now, any Republican who wants to win in a Republican primary, it's worse now because you have to win in a primary.
Got to put on that MAGA hat.
You got to do that. So that's the real story of the 1850s. I think that's similar to what's happening with the Republican Party now. And of course, the situation is different. It's not as extreme. But I can certainly see that happening, particularly if the Republicans do badly in the midterm elections. If they do badly, there are going to be, I think, a lot of Republicans, in places like the Northeast, where the Republican Party, used to be a viable political option, and no longer is. Right?
No, they can't win hardly anywhere now,
yeah, there are a lot of people who would love, to vote for, even a George Bush, right? But who can't.
Yeah.
And, people who are willing to say, yeah, we can come to some agreement on this. in Congress, and that certainly could happen. That there could be a split in the Republican Party, and if it does, I suspect one of the two remnants, if there are two, of the Republican Party will disintegrate. I think there's less likelihood of it happening in the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party now sees the possibility of power. They're not going to throw that away. But the Republican Party is, maybe in a process of self-destructing.
Yeah, it looks like it could happen. I mean, I know one of the possibilities that I can imagine is a libertarian party.
Yeah.
Because a libertarian party, if it was sort of kind of pro, you can smoke weed, you can, pro-gay marriage, basically, but from a position of the state should not be involved in your personal decisions, and also mix that with if they checked certain boxes, they could end up taking all sorts of votes from the Democrats because they would be kind of against big government and regulation and stuff like that, and then they could steal all sorts of votes from the Republicans as well, right? So I can imagine a libertarian party. I don't know if they could ever be like an actual kind of winner in a two-party system, but I think they could be a very strong third party, which would change. I mean, the United States has always gone with a two-party system, but it could end up being a really strong third party. And then it's possible that there could be basically a progressive party. Maybe that'll be the Democrats. Maybe there's one scenario that I imagine is that progressives basically capture the Democratic Party, and then people who are centrists, people who don't like safe spaces and don't like trigger warnings and are kind of are not totally down with the whole progressive agenda, but they don't want to be Republicans because they're like, well, no way. They could be shaved off into a libertarian party that would be that could be quite powerful in a lot of places.
Maybe. But I'm not. I don't know. I mean, I don't think a libertarian party would have a big future in America because too many people on both the right and the left are dependent upon, in one way or another, an activist government.
You just said something you're not supposed to say. I mean, it's totally true, but nobody wants to believe that. Everybody thinks they are for, freedom and independence, but not so much.
There are activists out there. I mean, the free market itself was a creation of an activist government, and the free market continues to be manipulated by an activist government at the behest of alleged free marketeers.
I remember seeing a map of the United States, and it was showing like federal spending, right? And it was showing like how much on average citizens of a particular state or region within a state, how much do they put into the federal system? How much taxes do they pay? And how much do they get back, right, from the government? And it was absolutely amazing. The parts of the United States that are most sort of liberal, most democratic, they are in general the places that put the most money into the federal government and get the least back. And the places that are, we're all into freedom and liberty, like places like Arizona that are all into kind of freedom and liberty, they get, something like $2 or $3 back for every $1 they put into the federal system. The red states in the middle of the country, they put in, they basically suck off the system. They are like the welfare queens of the federal system. They get massive amounts of federal money from an activist that does.
Look at just the state of California. If you look at a political map of the state of California, there are these huge red areas geographically. Not many people live in them, but huge. And these are the places that depend on huge federal largesse for water for irrigating these mega farms. They get huge amounts of federal money. And these, of course, are the reddest parts of California.
Yeah.
Right?
It's very bizarre. No, it's true. Well, that's what the map was showing, that it wasn't just across the United States from state to state. So places like New Jersey was the lowest. New Jersey taxpayers put the most amount of money into the system and get the least amount back. It wasn't just from state to state, like you say, it was within states. So very often the most, we don't want big government, we don't want, like, the most, like, kind of freedom-loving parts within a state are actually the welfare queens within that state. They're the districts that actually get the most state money, like to maintain their roads and things like that. And that's a kind of cognitive dissonance, which I don't even know how.
Well, I mean, it's been around for a long time. I mean, historians have long since debunked the myth of laissez-faire in America, and so it depends on who the government is being active for, right?
Well, it doesn't work that way in Canada. It's actually, that is a very big difference between the political culture of Canada and the United States. In Canada, the regions that have gotten the biggest amounts of transfer payments are solidly pro-big government. They vote liberal, reliably, the Maritimes, places like that. They really vote for... They understand which side of the bread is buttered. And meanwhile, the places that, like Alberta, since they were doing very well because of the oil, they were putting way more money into the system than they were getting out. And surprise, surprise, they were into smaller government. You had lots of libertarians there. So in Canada, regardless of what your politics are, it makes sense.
But build that pipeline in Alberta, right?
Yeah, it's rational in Canada. It's completely upside down. Completely upside down in the United States.
Yeah, well, it works differently in Canada too, because in Canada it involves mainly, though not entirely, transfer payments to the provinces. So the province is getting this huge amount of money or tax points or whatever they would get. Whereas in the U.S., it's not like a huge grant of money just going to the states. It's grants of money for specific things or tax breaks for specific interests. I mean, obviously there's both in both countries, but primarily in the U.S., I think it's a different matter.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to switch gears to something else. I have various things I wanted to ask you about. One of the things that makes American exceptionalism, the United States exceptional among the OECD countries, developed countries, is the fact that you have in the United States much higher rates of church attendance and mosque attendance, synagogue attendance. It's a much more religious country than a lot of other first world nations. Where do you think what is the state of American Christianity in the 21st century? What do you think? Where is it right now? Where do you think it's sort of going? I mean, it's because it just seems to me like things are changing a great deal. You've had the mega churches, you've had these, lots of non-denominational churches, you've had different new movements. I mean, what do you think's happening with American Christianity right now?
Well, there are some indications, I think, and I don't have the data in front of me, but there are indications that religion is becoming less important in American life. I mean, it's still, as you say, far and away more important to people's lives in the U.S., and church attendance is much higher and so on in the U.S. than in other OECD countries. That's for sure. But there is, I think, some evidence that church attendance is declining, that it may be becoming less important for people's behavioral norms. I wouldn't be altogether surprised if it did. It's the religious right may be fighting in the long run a rearguard action. may have declining influence. I think that may be the case. I don't want to write it off. I don't want to write it off completely. But of course, what the tendency has been up to now in American religion has been that the declining part of American religion is liberal Christianity.
Yeah.
You know, what was once called mainstream, but it's no longer mainstream. Yeah. What was once called mainstream Christianity, liberal Christianity, that has been absolutely the declining part. And the growing part has been that part of the Christian world in the United States that has become increasingly obsessed by their neighbors' behavioral issues, and indeed, legislating their neighbors' behavior. This is not new. We saw this in the evolution debates in the 1920s.
Yeah,
we saw it in Prohibition and so on and so forth. And so in some ways they've lost a lot of ground. Evolution, it's an issue in some places. Some school boards, still want to have creationism in their classrooms and things like that. But, the vast majority of Americans are not getting that in their schools. They live in places where they're not getting that. Prohibition is long since dead as an issue. So these new issues have developed, issues like the right to life, issues like sexual behavior, gay marriage, LGBTQ issues, and so on. And as I think about those, it seems to me that these issues are becoming narrow. I mean, we think, that the left is focusing on issues that are narrower and narrower in talking about these things. But, the right is too. These are things in which there's a growing consensus in American society that, gay marriage, okay, marriage is declining as an institution anyway. Why worry about it? And, which is what I think a lot of people actually probably think. So these are issues that I think are the religious right is becoming so obsessed over them because somehow they can see they're on the losing end of these debates.
These trends seem to be going in the wrong direction for them.
Yeah, I mean, you may get court appointments now with Trump that's going to sustain their positions for a while, but not in most places and not in the long run.
Well, this is central to the Breitbart doctrine, right? Where politics is downstream from culture, and so if you're trying to change the country by electing certain people or putting certain judges, that's not the way to do it. You have to actually try and change the culture.
You do have to try to change the culture.
What they've been doing,
and I think
Fox News and all the rest, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure that they are changing the culture. Fox News. I think Fox News is making the true believers more militant and more active politically. And that's, very effective. Again, I think in the short run, I hope anyway. But, it seems to me that's what's happening. And that, go back to the Scopes trial and go back to Prohibition. Churches were very active in that era, in the Prohibition era, and in getting anti-evolution laws put on the books. Very active. And when those issues became ultimately a dead end for them, they dropped out.
Yeah, they just dropped out of politics.
They dropped out. And, is that going to happen now with these issues? Because I think that they will become a dead end for them. And what will they do then? Will they support some American fascist alternative or something like that? Well,
that's what Chris Hedges thinks. It's
possible. I'm a little bit more optimistic.
So am I,
about America, but
he needs like some antidepressants or something.
But I get depressed all the time about American politics. But when I stop and think about it, I'm less so. So you ask about the future of religion in America. I think there'll always be a significant conservative religious element. Call it fundamentalist, call it whatever you want. The religious right. But I think, at least as we look toward the future, its political influence is waning, and that's why it's so desperate. That's why people like Fox News are out there, trying to get the troops out. That's why, to go back to an earlier question, it just occurred to me now, that's why they're so willing to support Trump, in a way they weren't, with early, like George Bush maybe, though I think most of them did. But that's why they're so willing to support Trump, because I think many of them are feeling desperate.
This is the last gasp. We got to get it now.
If we don't get it now, we're not going to get it.
Yeah, that makes sense. When I think about the parts of American Christianity that are most vital and green and alive, right? I think about going to these big evangelical churches in cities like Phoenix, places where the population has exploded overnight, where most of the people who live there were not born there. They moved there because their company transferred them to there or something like that. They're transient people. They moved there with their family, and they don't have any extended family there or any roots in that city. And they join the church, and the church provides them with a ready-made community, like a large community. And it's everything from if you need to get your car fixed. Oh, yeah, we got someone in our church that has a garage. You need to get plumbing done. Oh, we've got a plumber. It provides you with a whole network of people that you can trust in a new place, right? And what amazes me about these churches is that, because I've seen this in numerous places in the United States, but always in these very transient cities where everybody's sort of moving there, is that the churches are absolutely the most diverse grouping that you will see anywhere. They're more of they are the biggest force, I would say, of the American melting pot right now. You see people of totally different races, ethnicities, nationalities, different classes, totally different classes, interacting in one place. I don't know any other institution right now in the United States that brings such different people together, and out of the many, one than these evangelical churches. And that seems to me that is a very, very important function that they're providing, a unifying function that the public schools were supposed to do, but increasingly don't do, because people they sort of self-segregate into neighborhoods, and they send their kids to private school and stuff like that. So the public schools are not performing that function. The military service hasn't been performing that function since, probably World War II. So that seems to me like a very powerful thing. I mean, do you see that the churches are doing that?
That is a powerful thing, and it is a positive thing. And probably in the long run, even if you get these people out, voting for Trump or whatever, it still, I think, is a powerful thing in the long run. I mean, I think it's a good thing in the long run, and when you mention the public schools, the public schools ideally were supposed to do that. And in many places they did, excluding always the big exception, African Americans. they were always excluded from the public school melting pot. But in a lot of cities, you had the immigrants, you had the old stock Protestant Americans and stuff going to the same school. Even though there was considerable neighborhood segregation, it still happened. I mean, it certainly happened in my school when I was growing up. No more. That's just not something that's happening much anymore. And yeah, these churches are providing that. And, these churches have provided this sense of community, these sort of upstart churches, for a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been
hundreds of years.
doing a lot of work on Los Angeles in the 1930s.
Oh yeah, I wanted to ask you about that too.
Okay.
So that's a perfect segue.
But it was just like that. You had people, most of whom were born elsewhere, and 1930s Los Angeles was the place where this was, one of its characteristics that, liberal journalists always like to point out and laugh at and belittle and so on, that all these, Amy Semple McPherson types, flourished in Los Angeles. And they did. And again, they didn't then bring in many African Americans, though Amy Semple McPherson did bring in some, actually. But certainly they were multi-class, multi-ethnic institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And, they did the same thing.
Yeah, Neil Ferguson in his new book, it's a fantastic book, The Square and the Tower, which is all about kind of the history of networks and hierarchies and things like that. And in his book, he actually says, looking at the American example, he says the Masonic lodges were, if you look into sort of network theory, the Masonic lodges in colonial America were the number one way that you would meet somebody who was from a different class or a different background than you. They were a major kind of melting pot institution, the Masonic lodges. And he said after the kind of the know-nothings and the anti-Mason kind of movements and things like that happened in the 19th century, then the decline of the Masonic lodges. He said after that, with the Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening, it was the evangelical churches. They were the main institution, and he said they have been for a long time the main way in which people of very different backgrounds and different class backgrounds meet each other, right? So they are the kind of the places where people network.
Yeah,
it happens
It happened in Latin America too.
Really?
Now, this is not altogether well known,
I didn't know
and
that.
it wasn't so much from different class backgrounds, but people who shared sort of liberal ideological views, and virtually all.
But you mean like classical liberal, right? Like sort of free
Liberal,
market, freedom.
Tolerance, free speech, rule of law, this sort of thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Almost all, maybe all, of the classic Latin American liberators were Masons.
Wow.
Bolivar, San Martin, O'Higgins, the guy in Cuba.
I had no idea.
They all were Masons. And they got together in Masonic lodges and not only aired their grievances, but, devised
Conspiracies.
Yeah. And so it wasn't a multi-class thing in those countries, because the whole class structure was completely different. But it was people who were alienated from the dominant conservative, ultra-conservative Roman Catholic culture, and they were all Masons.
Yeah, well, that's
and in a society where Masonry was illegal. Right?
This fascinates me, because I'm not sure how we get at this. I mean, I know historians, people who study religion have been trying to get at this for a long time, but what religion actually means to people. Right, because sometimes, like what you just said about Latin America, I know Nassim Nicholas Taleb has told me the same thing about Lebanon, where he's from. He said if somebody says they're Christian in Lebanon, it doesn't necessarily mean they believe in God or they go to church. It actually is sort of code for they believe in tolerance. They believe in a more liberal outlook. They believe in it means a bunch of other things.
Drinking alcohol.
Yeah, it means a bunch of other things. They're in for kind of more pluralistic society.
Yeah.
They want a separation between the state and various groups and religions.
This was big for the Masons too in Latin America, separation of church and state.
Yeah, and so he says that the problem with Sam Harris types and kind of the new atheists is that they take. He has this hilarious expression. He says that atheists and fundamentalists are the only people who take religion literally. And he said they basically, but you have to actually look and see what religion actually means for people on the ground. And so, for instance, one of his many criticisms of Sam Harris is he says he looks at opinion polls that say that 55% of Americans believe in angels, and he says, "Oh my God, what a backward, unenlightened country this is." And Taleb's response is, "Well, when their kid gets hit by a car, do they call 911 or do they lay on hands and pray?" Well, if they call 911, then they're telling you what they actually believe. Are they really so anti-modern? Are they really so it's people tend to be, even if you're an Al-Qaeda fighter or ISIS fighter, they've all got cell phone. They love Apple technology, but we're going to blow you up. But people pick and choose, what what parts of the modern world they're okay with. Right. So I guess that's the thing that it's an unanswerable question perhaps, but I'm trying to get confused. What do you think religion means for Americans at this point? What does it stand for a lot of people? Because it seems like, to go back to my example of these transient cities, Steven Pinker, in a book that I know you read a couple of years back, The Better Angels of Our Nature. Steven Pinker makes the argument that the civilization process in the United States happened in two different ways. The north, sort of the northeast kind of north, was civilized in a very kind of northern European way, but the southern part of the United States was civilized primarily through religion, through Christianity. And he says the importance of Christianity and evangelical Protestantism to the South, to the old kind of that swath, the importance of religion to that area, you're missing the ball if you think it's just about kind of belief in metaphysical propositions. I mean, that could be the case for a lot of people, but he says it's primarily because this has been really central to how they tamed the West, how they just listen to any Johnny Cash song, right? It's all about how you get your life together and you're not in jail and drinking all the time and being a drunk. It's because you find Jesus, and this is that's why George W. Bush could appeal to these people so well, because he follows the redemption narrative, the salvation narrative that they all have, right? So, but that, and you can see in prison, the whole Nation of Islam, it's huge in prison. That's a pathway to redemption for especially African American men in prison, is to convert to Islam and to do that whole progression. So I'm wondering, what do you think Christianity means for American Christians in the 21st century? What?
Yeah, well, we get two messages from American evangelicals. I mean, we get one message from their leaders, which says, we have to get rid of abortion and gay marriage and things like that. That's the message we get from their leaders. Mm-hmm. And, I suspect that, most of their followers agree with that message. But is that what most of their followers really care about deeply in their daily lives? That may be something quite different. I think for many people, belief in God is central. They will ask themselves, what would Jesus want me to do in this situation? Sometimes they get it totally wrong, but at least they ask the question explicitly or implicitly in terms of their own lives. I think we talked about earlier, religion is important as community. I think it's really, really important as community especially for people, you mentioned transients, but for people whose lives have been disrupted in many kinds of ways. The Nation of Islam in prison, for example.
Yeah.
It becomes very important for giving, a sense of being, there's something out there that's more important than me, there's bigger than me, and I'm, kind of a part of that, and I can get support when I need that. Look at the old Germans in St. John Lutheran Church. What does religion mean for them, or what does church mean for them? Is it an intense and pious belief in God? Probably there's some of that, but a lot of it is it's
an ethnic club.
It's an ethnic club.
Like going to the Legion or something.
Yeah,
it's like
and that's important for them. That's important for a lot of people. I think religion still has that role to play. Where it's not there to play, you may have problems. You may have deeper problems. It may become a political movement that's not a very nice political movement. In an increasingly secularized society. I don't want to fall into the false parallels with Weimar Germany, but in an increasingly secularized society, people latched on to political movements, and not just of the right, to the left as well. But there's always something, that people have to have. They can't just be set loose and live out as somebody carving a place for himself in the wilderness, but survivalist, right?
I mean, we talk so
even
much
survivalists have communities.
They do. They absolutely do. We talk a lot about evangelical Protestants, but what do you think is going on with American Catholics? I mean, there's very fascinating stuff. They've got intense intellectual conservatives coming out of that tradition, sort of Judge Roberts types, and things like various. So I mean, and then with the influx of a lot of immigrants coming from Latin America,
right,
that tends to swell the ranks of American Catholic churches and things like that, and also immigration from other Catholic countries like the Philippines. So what do you think is going? Because that's a kind of interesting case, because they tend to not have. They tend to be very conservative on certain issues, and then really liberal on others.
On others,
yeah.
yes.
So
yeah.
I mean, what do you think? What is your sense of what's going on with?
Well, I mean, look
Catholicism
at Latin American immigrants, to take one example. Many immigrants from Latin America, whether from Mexico, Central America, wherever, have fairly conservative views on things like personal behavior, marriage, things like that, sexuality, very conservative views, and yet they form an important part of the base, an increasingly important part of the base for the Democratic Party in states like California and Arizona and Texas. So it's not all one. It's not all one thing.
Well, there's people like George W. Bush and, both of the Bush brothers and Ana Navarro and stuff like that, who are Republicans who have deep connections to those communities and are actively trying to create a future for the Republican Party among those constituencies.
Well, the Republicans threw that away
with Trump. Yeah,
I think they, and not just Trump, but all sorts of elements within the Republican Party that Trump appealed to. They just threw that away. I think that's
gone for good.
I think that's gone for good.
Wow.
Yeah, I think so. But of course, many of them many Latin American immigrants are populating Pentecostal churches or other evangelical churches, which are not necessarily conservative politically. These people will still vote Democratic, right?
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I thought of them as being solidly, Republican.
I don't think so. I mean, the solidly Republican immigrants in a state like California, and here I may be going out on a limb because this probably all changes too, are a lot of the Asian immigrants.
Yeah.
The Indian immigrants,
Yeah.
Vietnamese immigrants, Cambodian immigrants, and so on, who form a strong base for the Republican Party in places where they in states where they form a significant voting bloc.
Well, you're from LA. You grew up in LA, in Inglewood.
Yes.
And you've had a lifelong sort of interest in American movies, and you've taught on American movies a great deal, and
Right.
you're writing a book on that. So what is the relationship between American reality and American cinema? Because it just seems like a very wacky and interesting story. What's the relationship?
I think that American cinema played off of American values, or the values held by a lot of people. I don't think it was that movies influenced people. They went to the movies and they were influenced in certain ways to behave. I think it was the opposite. I think for a long time, certainly during Hollywood's so-called golden age of the 30s, 40s, 50 into the 50s, which I'm most familiar with, it was that American movies portrayed things that Americans wanted to believe about themselves, even if it didn't really reflect their day-to-day lives. It reflected about things about what their lives ought to be like, in part at least. I mean, there were also movies that, focused on crime and things like that, allowed Americans to sort of experience kind of the darker side of things in America, but ultimately where the good guys always won in the end anyway. And I think that
Most of the time. Then there's the Dirty Harry and the kind of like...
Yeah, well, that comes later. That comes
post-Watergate kind of thing.
That's the 1960s and 70s, and that sees a real sea change in American movies. And again, not so much because American movies were, out in the forefront, leading America into the new millennium, but because American movies were catching up to changes in American society, and once again, following from the rear. And you see that in Hollywood now, with not just the sexual predations of Hollywood moguls and directors and things like that, but the concern about not enough African Americans in significant roles in American movies, and not just in roles, but in making movies, women making movies, and still, grossly underrepresented in the American film industry. So the film industry is sort of catching up with that now too. Every once in a while you come across a movie that's ahead of the curve on something, but for the most part, Hollywood is always leading from behind, I think.
I remember
Pretty
you
much.
said once you said once in a class, this has been like 2 decades ago, but I remember you said somebody brought up in class, they put up their hand, snarky, young guy, and he said, why do American movies suck? And he's like, I watch French movies and like all these other, and they're so amazing, and like Hollywood movies suck. And your response was, I thought it was very, very interesting. And I thought it was almost like a patriotic American response at first, but you said, well, all those other sort of cinemas, national cinemas you're talking about, they are heavily, heavily subsidized by the state, by taxpayers. And so they may seem very risque and avant-garde and amazing, but they're actually like totally paid for by taxpayers and stuff like that. And he said American movies are, for the most part, they actually support themselves.
They have to make money.
They have to make money, which means they have to actually appeal to wide audiences, and they can't just put their hand out for taxpayer money all the time. And so to say that an American movie is a little too sexy, a little too violent, a little too vulgar, and not thoughtful enough, well, the ones you're saying are better probably were seen by a few thousand people, at all.
Yeah, well, I mean, American movies also had it was a big industry, much bigger than it is now. Back in the day, the golden age, it was a big industry, and a lot of people worked in it who were very creative. And sure, they couldn't do what they wanted necessarily, but some of them had a remarkable ability to incorporate subtexts into the movies that often made them not only critical but insightful. Now, whether the average moviegoer actually read those subtexts or saw that is another question.
So were these like lefty dog whistles?
I'm not talking about lefty dog whistles.
Okay.
I'm talking about more things like human relationships, marriages, love affairs, things like that. And the really funny things that they could do was it the movie The Awful Truth, I think, in the late 1930s, where this couple's getting a divorce. Of course, they'll have to get back together again in the end, but they're getting a divorce. They're in the process of getting a divorce, And what are they fighting over for custody? They're fighting over for the custody of their pet dog. Well, obviously the movie couldn't show them fighting over the custody of a child. That wouldn't go in Hollywood, And so they're fighting over the custody of the dog.
I've actually seen that happen in real life with couples fighting over the So okay.
So I mean, they could do this. Hitchcock movies always penetrated into the darker recesses of our souls. A lot of the film noir did in the 1940s. Absolutely, there were some pretty nasty characters and pretty nasty things going on in film noir. So they could do some remarkable things, often in low budget movies. But
well, one thing I've noticed, and this is not just in the movies, this is a wider trend. You see it in novels, you see it in lots of things, where very often the main character in the story is a writer.
Yes.
Right. And, when you encounter this one time, I remember when I was like a teenager reading novels and like watching movies, and when you encounter the main character being a writer once, you think, okay, whatever. But the 50th time that you encounter a writer being the main character, you start to think, well, these writers that produce this stuff are a really narcissistic and uncreative lot. Like, why is it always somebody like them, like a sort of nerdy, like introverted, like person who sits in the corner? Why are they always?
You're thinking of the Coen brothers.
Barton Fink.
Barton Fink.
Well, Barton Fink, they're kind of tongue in cheek making fun of that.
Yeah.
But they're very, very self-consciously making fun of that trend.
But even the fact that they're making fun of it suggests
there's
something out there.
But when I look at the movies from the golden age of American cinema, one of the things that's fascinating is that that's not the case then. They seem to have just a much more kind of panoramic view of, they're looking at a lot of different things, right? So who were the people that were, because I know this is the book that you're working on right now, like who were the people that were making movies in LA? Like, they must have been a different crowd. I mean, they were.
Okay, well, I mean, the book actually is not so much about making movies as such, but plays off the myth of Hollywood against the the reality of Hollywood, of life and work in Hollywood. And it was a very transient society, like the one we were talking about. So transient societies is something I'm interested in. I mean, most of the people who actually worked in the film industry were just ordinary workers, right? They were not what was known as talent.
Mm-hmm.
You know, talent were the actors, the directors, the writers, the film editors. Those were talent. Everybody else, you know, they were carpenters, they were electricians, they were, you know, property people, they were this, they were that, makeup
Extras
people.
or whatever, yeah.
Yeah, and then, of course, in terms of the cast, you had a whole hierarchy within the film industry, from the stars who were at the very top and got the big salaries and top billing and got most of the publicity and so on, you know, to the featured players, the character actors, the credited actors in small parts, the bit players and the extras. You know, you go all the way down the hierarchy. And, you know, what really made Hollywood in those years were the people who were lower on the hierarchy of acting in many ways, because these were people that audiences were familiar with from movie to movie to movie.
The usual suspects.
The usual
characters,
suspects, the usual characters. And they played similar kinds of roles. You know, they were typecast as a proper judge, you know, a crook, a hitman, a maid, you know, whatever it was, they tended to be typecast in these roles. And the very fact that they were in movie after movie, in hundreds of movies, allowed people to feel, you know, a sense of identity with the movie. You know, oh, I'm at home in this movie.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is, you know, the guy who plays the district attorney. You know, and
wow, so it made this new medium conventional.
That's my hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
I think it did. And yes, people were fascinated with the stars, and they read the gossip magazines and followed their love life and their marriages and so on and so forth. And, you know, movies had star power. You know, if a movie starred Clark Gable, people were going to go see it in all likelihood. But I really think what drew these people in was the familiarity.
That fits completely with Nietzsche's theory of cultural production, because Nietzsche says that a really successful work of art, what it has to do is it has to provide the audience with the perfect mix of new and old. The perfect mix of predictable and conventional and like what is known, with enough variation and enough surprises that it's interesting. And he said if you have too much too predictable, then it bores people and they glaze over. If it's too new, it turns people off or it bores them. So you have to have, so that would make perfect sense that having these sort of typecast characters, it was a way in which you have this new medium. And the problem with any new medium is that a lot of people can be put off by it, right? They don't understand. So by having these conventions, then it's you know, it's like when you look at the Japanese drama and like they put the hand like this and everybody in the audience knows that means a certain thing, right? And so there are these conventions that allow you to enjoy the show, right? So if you have these stock characters, they would be something that I like, that it makes you feel at home in the movie, that it would give you enough of I'm trying to remember his exact term. Yeah, he says foreign sounds our ears do not hear well, right? And so we like a kind of a good mix between new and old. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This was a real delight, and I would like to do this again in the future. Absolutely. So, yes, if you would like to support the Likeville podcast, please like us on iTunes. That's great. Please subscribe on iTunes, and also, share our podcast with your friends, even with your enemies. And also, if you'd like to support us financially, you can do so through Patreon. All right. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye for now.